Hi, everybody. This is your host, Mr. Allen. Welcome to another great episode of our podcast. Thank you for tuning in. So today is May 19th. So Texas is one of the few states that has reopened our businesses. And so even though our shelter in place is no longer enforced, people are still encouraged to practice social distancing, limiting physical touch, and staying at home when you don't feel well. So even though we are slowly acclimating back to normal life and reopening businesses again, we know that we are not out of this pandemic and we still need to be cautious and practice the CDC recommendations. And it is going to be some time till things are back to normal. I mean, I think something you notice about me is that I have gotten a haircut since my first podcast to now. And so, yeah, things are kind of opening back up in Texas. And so that's kind of where we're at right now. But the thing is that we're still going through this, and so life is still weird. And so a couple of weeks ago, Jacqueline and I talked about a lot of different issues about how our mental health can be affected during this pandemic. And Jacqueline talked about how pandemics can be traumatic. And it can be traumatic for those who are directly exposed or those who are indirectly exposed to COVID-19. And trauma was such a big topic and focus before the pandemic hit. And so this podcast today is going to focus mostly on trauma and why it is so important that we understand how it affects us and others. Today, I am talking to Mr. Denny Singh, who works as an intervention specialist with Fort Worth ISD. He's currently assigned at William James Middle School in Fort Worth. I have known Denny for about 6 years now. He was my supervisor during my internship as a master's student. He also served as my LPC supervisor until I reached my hours and became an LPC. And professionally and personally has made a huge impact on my life. And Denny has a ton of experience working with adolescents with juvenile probation, nonprofits, and the school district. And so here he is, my guest today, Mr. Denny Singh. Denny, you there?
Hey, I'm here, Alan. How you doing?
Doing good. How are you?
I'm hanging in there. Thanks for letting me come in here and talk with you and hopefully reach some people out there that may need some help. So thank you.
Absolutely. I'm curious because so yesterday was your birthday. And so I've heard a lot of people talk about like unique ways that they've had to celebrate their birthdays. So I know that we're a little bit different because technically you could go to a restaurant if you wanted to or go out if you wanted to. But like, how did you celebrate your birthday?
Well, how? Okay, let's start off with that one because I think you're right. I think it's affected how people even celebrate, our milestones, birthdays. So for me, we just did a simple thing at home. It was more just family only. But I know a lot of people who have had birthdays and they're real big about going out and having a big celebration. I think it affects them a little bit more than for me. I'm pretty simple nowadays because I'm not going to let you know what number I celebrated yesterday, but I've kind of, backed off. You young people probably are missing going out more than I am. But yeah, I think a lot of people are finding it hard to deal with all kinds of social gatherings, whether they're celebrations or even grieving, funerals. And we can talk about that with trauma later. But yeah, I kept it simple. So.
Yeah. And so how is this whole pandemic, like, how has it changed your life? Like, how's it affecting you?
Oh, wow. Well, I actually have been thinking about this, talking to people. I think it's very easy for us to get really focused on COVID, this virus. But I was talking to another therapist, and they were mentioning about how life goes on and trauma, which is something that affects all of us. There's everyday things that are still going on, like people losing family members, not to COVID, but just, to various things, and how just with the virus, it's made it harder. Like I said, you can't gather to have a funeral to say goodbye to a loved one. So for me, it's just been hard because my mother, who's older and lives with me, has been being treated for lymphoma. So we have to be extra cautious. Yeah. So it's real hard. We have to be extra cautious. What happens if we bring something back to her? She's pretty isolated and we keep her kind of safe, but that's the scary thing. I mean, it could come in on your shoes. I mean, I'm not trying to get people paranoid, I think it's good to be safe. And so for me, it's been more, it would have been hard without COVID, but I think the COVID has just added that extra layer of anxiety and stress that can cause us to really, you know, be affected. So yeah, I think, like I said, I don't want to like complain too much at the same time, because there are people out there that are struggling with job loss, other things that were directly COVID related. So I know that's been really hard, and a lot of students, families of students that I know, they've been dealing with that. But for me on a personal level, it's just made it harder to deal with just everyday trauma, everyday struggles. So I know it's just, something that, we have to be recognizing, more. So.
Yeah, and I'm sorry to hear about that with your mom. And yeah, I mean, I think it's just crazy because I feel like that's hard enough as it is, to deal with that, and now you're adding on to something we've never experienced before, which is where it just feels like we go outside and we're just not safe. And so it's like we have to be even more cautious than we already were going to be, like with a family member's condition like your mom's.
Sure. Yeah. So I think it's sort of like, it's just another layer, but it's a huge layer that adds on top. And so, like I said, and we've both worked with similar types of students and kids and adolescents, and we already know that they come with a history of difficulty, like in the past and current. So it's like, to me, COVID's just like this giant, huge rock on top of an already big problem, and it's just putting that pressure down on. So yeah, my heart goes out to people that are struggling even worse. And like I said, people have lost friends and family members directly, because that, that is the most direct impact of COVID. And that's really, a sad thing. But I do believe in resiliency, and hopefully we'll talk about that. I don't want to just talk about the downside, but I think that trauma is an opportunity for growth. So I hope that people will use this as a way to kind of strengthen their social, emotional, mental, physical muscles, if you want to say something like, and something positive can come out of it. And I think there are things like that are already coming out, and so hopefully we can build on it. So.
Yeah, for sure. And yeah, before we get into like trauma, like specifically into that, I want people to get to know you and kind of understand your journey. Like, what made you want to become a counselor?
Wow. I it's funny. Some people, they ask me that, and I look back and my memory's fading, of course, because of old age, but I just like to, I don't think it was one big moment where I just felt like, I want to be a counselor. I don't think I even knew what a counselor was. I mean, back in my day, there was more of a stigma. So I don't think I even knew of friends that were going to see counselors even when they were teenagers. So, for me, it was probably looking back and just seeing that I enjoyed helping people. Like a lot of times, even in high school, people would come to me with problems, and I didn't know what I was doing. Maybe I even gave advice, which I kind of cringe at, because I don't think counseling is all about giving advice. I mean, that too. So for me, it was probably more of a process of what are these experiences and how can they lead me to something, and it led me to being a counselor. So I feel it was partly this wanting to help. I wanted to be in a helping profession, and the fact that people were coming to me kind of made me feel like, wow, I can maybe do something. I can, maybe this is the way I can help. And so, I changed my journey from pre-med medicine. Sometimes I think, okay, what would have happened there? But I went to the other path, and so that's kind of, been a process. It wasn't just one lightning bolt that hit me from the clouds and told me like, I am going to be a counselor. So that's why I tell actually kids, because a lot of kids will say, I don't know what I want to be. And I say, it's not just a big moment. It's a process. You have to look at it a little deeper. So for your answer, it's probably, it was a process. It wasn't just one specific time or one specific situation. So, yeah.
I'm glad that you said that, because I think that's sometimes we have that pressure, like out of high school or even when we're in college, of figuring out what it is that we want to do. And I was very similar. Like, I didn't really know I wanted to go into counseling until like actually it was after I graduated with my undergrad and I was in the business world for a little bit, is whenever I
Mm-hmm.
discovered kind of more that was my passion, was talking to people and helping people, and being able to do that. And so, yeah, I feel like, yeah, life is a journey and life is a process. And I think that's such a great point to bring up, that it's just kind of a journey. And sometimes our journeys just go in
Yeah.
different directions.
Right, and you have to be open to the experience, right? Like for
Yeah.
you were able to go one path, which showed you where to change that path. And trauma can also provide opportunity. I mean, just think of all
Right.
the young people that will be impacted or motivated to go into healthcare because of this. There may be a lot of
Mm-hmm.
young people that said, I lost someone, or
Mm-hmm.
this happened, and I think that's so inspiring. That's why I love working with young people, because
Yeah.
you're right. I mean, it's about experiences and being open to the process. And they say that most of the jobs of the future aren't even set up yet. They're not even created. So it's
Sure.
better to know who you are. You can't have a specific, like, I'm going to be some people can, like, I want to be a doctor. I want to be this. But, there's so many options that aren't even like in place yet. So I
Mm-hmm.
think you have to be open. So you're right. It's a
Yeah,
journey. We're still on the journey, right?
for
So,
sure. Yeah, and you kind of talked about that. Like, it's something else I was going to ask you was, like, what was one of your favorite things about being a counselor? And you talked about working with students. And so, have you always known that you wanted to work with students since you decided to become a counselor?
that's a good question. Like I said before, I enjoyed talking to my peers when I was in high school. I was kind of a peer counselor. I mean, yeah, I don't know if that's a good word, peer counselor, but I think in a way I haven't grown up from that, because I just enjoyed that experience. So maybe I'm kind of stuck like Peter Pan, where I get older, but I do get older, and it's like, I just feel very inspired and drawn to this, group, this kind of population. I joke, if you're like in the 20s, you might be considered old working with me,
Mm-hmm.
but it does make me realize that some things are timeless. Some of the challenges that kids face are timeless, but then the context changes. So you have to be aware. So for example, bullying is been around forever, but now
Mm-hmm.
with the internet, like, that has added an extra layer of risk, and has truly affected kids' social emotional welfare. So I think it's very important to keep knowledge, keep gaining knowledge about things around you. Like I joke, I don't know all the movies and the music that kids watch, but I need to keep myself educated on what's out
Mm-hmm.
there as far as what they're using online. How is that affecting them emotionally? So I yeah, that's kind of, what I try to do, is try to, stay connected in that way. But I approach teenagers and students like a sociologist, because they're a different culture. And I think that's what makes them feel I care, because I'm not trying to over relate. I just tell them, like, tell me something about your favorite song. That's really important to kind of put on different hats. You're not just a therapist or a counselor or intervention specialist. You're looking at it from all these different angles for what's the best way to help that particular person or that group of people. So
Mm-hmm.
that's why I love it, because there's an energy to working with them, that I think is just awesome. And society tends to still think of a teenager as just this total kind of lost cause, and oh my
Mm-hmm.
God, look what they're doing. And I find them to be the future. They are the future, literally. So, we have to invest the care to help them reach their best, to reach their potential, because it's for all of us. I mean,
Yeah.
so that's the selfish part of it. I tend to think of it as, if I can help that kid, in a way that helps all of us. So that, what's in it for me? That's probably what's in it for me, is that, by helping someone else, you can help another. And that's what COVID's all about here. We're all in this together. So, by me wearing a mask, if that helps keep me safe and someone else, we doesn't matter what your race, religion, background, politics, all that stuff. It really doesn't matter. It's the basic human condition of care, and so
Yeah.
that's what I think of when I think of these kids. It's like, I'm caring for them, but I also want them to be able to give back to someone else.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. And
sorry, you have to cut me off if
gosh.
I go out. You know me, Alan. If I
I
go on too
do.
long, you're
I
gonna have
mean,
to edit. Yeah, yeah.
there's so many things I think can elaborate on all that. And one thing I do want to highlight is, I mean, you have been counseling for a while, and so I mean, you've seen like transitions, like with like internet bullying being a little bit more prevalent, and like just going through like, and now we're like in a situation where we're going through a trauma, and how mental health and how people are going to react this way. And so it's just it's something that like our school never prepared us for. It's something that we never really could be prepared for. And so I just think that's interesting. I think more of that will come out as we discuss more. Before we talk about trauma, there's one more thing I want to ask you, which is because you do work with Fort Worth ISD, which is a school that we are very close with, that we arrange pickups for our kids to pick up from. And so a lot of our students are Fort Worth ISD students. And so I kind of want to understand like your role as what does an intervention specialist do? And also how your role has changed since the pandemic happened, since things are now virtual.
Yeah, that's a great question. As a matter of fact, I get that question the most from students, because a lot of students don't know what we do and how are we different from a school counselor. So basically, the intervention department, the department that I work for, was created to provide a real extra layer of socio-emotional support and to promote social-emotional learning in students. So we have a mix of professionals. We have social workers, we have licensed counselors, we have licensed marriage and family therapists. So we have a good variety of professionals, but our goals are all the same. It's to develop those social, emotional skills and learning that's essential for someone to become a more, to lead a better life past high school. I mean, you can get an education and learn all your grades, but if you don't have the people skills, unless you plan to live on an island or you think that COVID's going to keep us in our houses all day long, we're going to have to learn how to get along with each other and also know what we are thinking and feeling and be able to express that in appropriate ways. Because to me, behavior is communication. And you know my love, I wouldn't be able to go a minute without telling you, you're my love of all things on the autism spectrum. I've learned that is not only for kids on the autism spectrum, but for any kid. So when a kid is quote unquote acting out, or when a kid is showing bad behavior, I really get nervous, because that is showing a disregard for the impact of trauma, and they are communicating, they are expressing. So to get to your second kind of part of the question of how my role has changed, it has become challenging. The students that I see at school, I was a consistent, and when they came to school, it was a lot easier to get them out of the class or check on them and address something right there. Being online, there is a barrier. Just because we're connected doesn't mean, like I tell parents sometimes, hey, that phone that you kind of despise sometimes, but then you like to track it to see where your son or daughter goes, it also has caller ID. So if you try to call them, they can see who it is and they don't have to answer. It's like there's no technology that's going to force someone to communicate with you if they don't want to. So, that element has been really hard. It's been able to, because I have a lot of students that are considered even higher risk, and I worry about them, but I can't easily get to them. So, that can be also technology. Technology, our district has been doing a really good job of trying to get technology out to kids and their families, Wi-Fi hotspots. But as you know, and as a lot of parents who maybe are watching know, technology is not cheap and it's not everywhere. And just because a lot of people in a certain neighborhood have the highest speed internet doesn't mean that other people, 10 miles away are going to have the same access. So that presents a challenge. So, there's been just a lot of challenges with technology, reaching students, adapting. But I think this is what we have to do, is we have to I can't give up. I have to come up with other ways to engage, find, and communicate with students and parents. And, just to let you know, one of my biggest tasks is that I do a lot of risk assessments when kids start to express ideas that they want to harm themselves or they don't want to live, stuff that is pretty serious. And the school district makes it a priority to assess them. So, if there is something where someone said something or they're looking on a website and the district can see that what they're looking at, then I'm the one to follow up on that. And so that's where technology can help. but it still comes down to a human connection. You have to have that connection. It's never going to replace the human relationship. And that's what we're seeing now. We're seeing the struggles of that, even knowing you. See, I know you, and I would prefer to see you, with a cup of coffee at Starbucks, but under the circumstances, we're doing this. So just imagine how a kid may feel who doesn't have an adult, maybe doesn't really have access to a lot of solid, supportive adults. That's going to be hard to replace. And luckily, when they're at school, I can try to be more like that person, and I can go and, make that eye contact and have that human presence, that feeling, that we all miss. And I just want to say, and I know you need to keep me in line here, but when people want to know what a human presence feels like, I don't know about you, Alan, but for me, and I'm a Marvel fan, okay, full disclosure, I love my Marvel. To me, there is a difference between going to see the latest Avengers movie in a packed, excited theater versus watching it on your iPhone. Okay, I'm sorry. There's an energy there, and that's hard to study. It's hard to break down in scientific terms, but it's something that's real, and that's just a movie. So imagine missing graduation, missing family reunions. I mean, this is going to take a toll, and we have to be ready to help. So that's my long answer. But that's what I feel. So.
Yeah, and you know what's funny is I was actually talking about this with somebody about how last year that's when Endgame came out, and I was so excited about that movie coming out and everything. Like we were waiting literally a year after Infinity War and the cliffhanger, and I was thinking, gosh, if this had happened that year, where I had to wait to watch that movie, I would have been like
really
crushed. I would have been like, I waited this long and now it's like postponed till. And I agree. Like when you went to the and I think all Marvel fans can agree with this. And whenever you went to the theater and were with all those people and community and and everyone was cheering, everyone was excited. Like it was awesome. Like I can't imagine, like say they just told us, well, we can't go to the theater, but here you could watch it on your TV. It definitely wouldn't have that same feel. It definitely wouldn't have those kind of things.
Yeah, and just think that's just a movie. Now I don't want to minimize, people's stress over missing a movie. That's true, but just imagine. I mean, when we're working with kids with high level of trauma, you may be like the biggest highlight of the day. See, and so Alan, I think a lot of times therapists or counselors like overthink. And for me, I tell you, at my school, I just try to go around with a positive attitude, even if I'm having a bad day, because I want to be that one brief moment of positivity in that kid's life, even if it's just smiling and say, hey, how you doing? Keep it up. Good work in class. I heard that you did good. It's just that brief. All it takes is this like 5 seconds. It's not, you don't have to go get a master's or get a license to make an impact in a kid's life. All the tarmac, all the, people we worked at this program that we worked, we met each other at. There were great volunteers who came in and just did incredible work. They weren't trained. I mean, they just had a positive spirit. So I want to encourage everybody. It's like, you know what? We can try to do that even through distance. But when we come back from this and when we take steps outside, we don't have to see other people as that's a risk. That's I'm scared because that person may infect me. We have to still be able to, show something to them, even if it's pulling down a mask to smile for a second or just to say thank you through a muffled mask. I mean, whatever it is, we have to use this as an opportunity to connect deeper, than we were before, better. But I'm with you. I was, I would have been stressed if Endgame wasn't, if it was coming out there. So I arrived there. I can relate to that stress, but don't worry.
Yeah, and I'm glad that and that's just so important is connection. And I mean, I think I can share like, my upbringing, I did not grow up with like the way a lot of my kids at the Boys and Girls Club have. But at the same time, like kind of like what you said, just taking a genuine interest in people and wanting to get to know them and just being able to have that connection is something that's so important. And it's something that, with what's happened and them not being able to be with us, I mean, that I miss every day. And I'm sure that you do too, is just missing that experience of really being in person and getting to hear about life, because
Oh yeah.
I mean, you can be connected through technology, but at the same time, there are those limitations. All right, so what I want to do is I really want to start getting into about trauma. And so I think this is I think this is so appropriate that I talk to you about this, because before I even started working at Boys and Girls Club, you talked to me, like before I got that job, you mentioned this is something that you need to know. You said you need to go know about trauma and how it affects people. You're like, this is the buzzword in therapy. This is something that's going to be around for a long time. It's something it's something very important that you kind of understand and be able to treat people. And so I want to ask you, like for the audience, is what is trauma, and what are ways one might experience trauma, and how can it be recognized?
All right, great question. I didn't predict that we were going to all be in like this common trauma of this COVID, but yeah, I think it's important to know that trauma is an event or something that happens that causes people to react in somewhat negative ways. When I say negative, they can have, maybe they react and they have higher anxiety, higher levels of depression. They have physical reactions. They have, they can't sleep. There's all kinds of things that can be considered symptoms of trauma. But the important thing to me is that it's not really the event that, that can be the event, the thing that initiated, but it's our reaction. Our reaction to the event is what is really the true trauma. Because as 10 people can react very differently to the same event. So for some people, it's like, whoa, they're very resilient for whatever reason. They can handle it. They can manage that. For others, they kind of fall in that pitfall, that trap of struggling. And so I do think it's important, because I know there's lots of people that are out there that may think of trauma kind of as just the event, and that's true to a degree. That event is part of what can become more formal trauma, but really it's more the long-lasting impact of the event. So if you're struggling or you have a really bad reaction to an event, that becomes the trauma that you have to deal with. So I think that's really key. And like I said, there's a physical reaction to trauma. So I would want to say, like, I don't know if people that watch this would be familiar, but there's something called the ACEs, which is the Adverse Childhood Experience kind of survey or study. And it's simply talking about things that can cause trauma to people that are younger people from birth to 18 years old. So they include things like divorce of parents. They include things like abuse. And it's a 10-question kind of questionnaire. It's really easy to take. I mean, you can go, there's a website called safelaunch.org, but you can Google it. I would really encourage people, even adults and parents, to go take that so they can start to become knowledgeable about what's happened to them. What have they been dealing with? And I know it can trigger maybe some traumatic memories, but I think the first step to empowerment is knowledge and to be aware. And so I would really recommend that people kind of look at that, because that's very important to know that what happens to you as a child can have long-term effects, and it can last until adulthood. It can last generationally. So maybe, Alan, but other people might not know this, that long-term trauma can last throughout generations. For example, African Americans who were enslaved hundreds of years ago can develop physical reactions that can be passed on through descendants. So you can have high blood pressure, you can have reduced lifespan. And I know that's kind of gloomy and scary for people that say, whoa, am I going to be affected by something I didn't do? But I think the promise within that is that you can, if you understand trauma and educate yourself in trauma and start to take steps to address it, whether it's changing lifestyle, whether it's, getting into good, solid, supportive relationships with people, that can help change those patterns. I mean, you're not set up to fail. So when we talk about cycles of poverty, cycles of things, that really is reflecting trauma. Those cycles are created by trauma. And so we need to help, educate, and it starts with us. So I would say to everyone that may be listening to this, check into ACEs. It's really important to know that you may be dealing with some trauma yourself and you might be coping okay, But it's good to know. Why do we get our cholesterol checked? Why do we weigh ourselves every time we go to the doctor's office? It's very important to also look at trauma, and hopefully doctors will start to embrace this, because that's important too for how to deal with unhealthy habits that are in part linked to the trauma. So yeah, I know that's a long answer. Sorry, I'm going to shorten it up. By the time we finish, I'm going to have really better, shorter answers for your audience.
No, you're good. I think so. It's interesting. So you talked about earlier how you were pre-med before you became a counselor. And so you talked about like doctors like understanding this. And so do you know who Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris is?
Yes, the deepest well. Yeah.
Yes.
Awesome.
And so, so she did so she's the Surgeon General of California right now. I think she's the first Surgeon General of California right now. And so she did a TED Talk about, I think it was 5-6 years ago, maybe longer than that, about childhood trauma. And so this is somebody in the medical field. And so pretty much Dr. Burke-Harris, she discussed how she worked in one of the poorest hospitals and underserved neighborhoods in San Francisco. And she noticed that a lot of her patients in that area had some really bad health conditions. And something that she discovered as well, along with those health conditions, was that they also experienced trauma. And she really looked into, and like when she was doing research, she actually discovered what you're talking about, which is the ACEs study. And she talked about how that needed to be something that was incorporated into the medical field. And so what I think is so interesting about this whole thing is that it's not like she was able to understand that it's not just about the symptoms, but it's also about the underlying causes of what leads to it, because there's this root cause that's leading to medical problems for someone, and that it's not just affecting that person, but it's affecting like the nation as well, because you're using that money to go into the medical field when we can use that. You get an understanding of prevention and intervention for these ACEs, and it's just, I think what's so interesting is how I feel like our whole body is just very holistic. Like it's not just a mental thing or emotional thing or a physical thing. Like everything is can connect and relate to one another and really have a big impact on our life. And so, I mean, I think that's really, I think that's just awesome that somebody in the medical profession sees that and is advocating for that. And and I hope so too. Like I think that's very important that that doctors understand that and see that as well.
And I'm glad you talked about holistic, because I know I might have left that out. And I'm with you. I mean, I think right now we're seeing like climate change, and with the virus, we're all part of this system in the world. So, when we're dealing with health, it's not just physical health. And so I think even if we don't get doctors open to the idea of trauma, which I think that's changing, we can still empower patients to go to the office and bring this stuff up. That if it's not in your paperwork, you could still be brave enough, and you do need to be brave to be able to tell a doctor, I have experienced abuse, or I have experienced depression. We minimize that with our doctor anyway. So, I mean, I think we need to have that open conversation, but I'm glad that at least the intervention department at the Fort Worth district is embracing the idea of trauma, because the best patient is the most informed patient. And if we can start teaching even grade school kids about there's this thing called trauma, and it's okay to have these feelings associated with it, there's some things they can change, but there's a lot of things they can't. And maybe that can empower them, and they can grow up to be less impacted by trauma and more resilient, like the people I told you about that can resist. We can get resistant to a vaccine. If we have a vaccine, we can resist a virus. So why can't we, help strengthen our systems to trauma impact, and then help us with our whole being and our whole wellness. And I do have a story I'm going to tell you before we end. You got to give me time to tell. You probably know the story, but I'm going to share a story about trauma that hopefully maybe a young person can even understand that I've used with kids. So remind me, Alan, that my memory. So.
Okay, I'll try to remember. Hopefully I can remember too.
Right.
So I think what's interesting is, so we're both in similar positions. Like mine is prevention, so trying to prevent something from becoming a huge issue. Yours is intervention, but we both kind of use both senses. Like we both, sometimes I have to do intervention and in some ways, same with you, you're like using like education or talking as a way of prevention, like so that it doesn't become a bigger issue later for their lives. And so that's why you're intervening right now. And so I
Mm-hmm.
think something that's really important, I'm so glad you talked about the ACEs, is that I think that I think that we work in a population where a lot of ACEs are happening. People are experiencing it. And I
Yeah.
know that we've worked with a lot of kids who have experienced a good amount of ACEs. And we talked about the higher ACEs, the higher the risk. And so are there ways that trauma might be experienced or expressed differently between cultures, ages, or gender?
That's a good question. And like you said, the higher your ACE score, like if it's, it's up to 10,
Mm-hmm.
actually that affects your lifespan. So let's be real clear. It actually directly affects your lifespan. So we're talking
Uh-huh.
about literally life and death situations, and maybe a slow death in some cases, but an advanced death. So it's very important to reach kids at a young level. And I think, that's one thing we have to look at in the education system is how do we not label kids as being bad? How do we try to see their behavior as a way to communicate needs and to be able to say, uh, not instead of saying what's wrong with you, it's more like what's happened to you, what's your
Mm-hmm.
story, and create interventions that can speak to them. And so, like you said, I look at intervention as an opportunity for prevention. They're just two sides of a coin. So if I intervene when a student is upset, I may not be able to. That's not the opportunity. I want to get them to a stable, point, but I want to plant seeds that are like prevention seeds, so that person can have a chance not to repeat the same choice and to help themselves. But I think that, it will take a lot more research and study. And I'm glad, like what you said, we're going to have to look at things through a lens of race. We're going to have to look at the lens of socioeconomic status, the impact of
Mm-hmm.
that. We have to look at the lens of what, sexuality, where someone is on that spectrum, LGBTQ. I mean, that's associated with a certain level of trauma as well. And
Mm-hmm.
so, we're going to have to look at things more individually. There's not going to be a one size fits all. And so, that's the way I approach it. Like a lot of kids may act out in similar ways, but I'm not going to take a cookie cutter approach to dealing with them. I'm going to come back to the relationship and connect on that level. And hopefully that makes a difference. And so, like I said, that's a big question with not a lot of answers. So
Mm-hmm.
I think we just have to try to do the best we can, individually, and then collectively we have research and things that can help guide us in a macro level, with society. So
Yeah,
I don't
and
know my answer.
I think what's fascinating about this is that say like you're a young, like with the ACEs study, it's what happens before you're 18, like 18 or younger. And so you may be experiencing these things and thinking that you might not think that it's really abnormal that like say like abuse or incarceration or substance dependence or any of those things are like kind of out of the normal and the how that can really affect your life because as a kid your brain is still developing and still gaining these ideas. And so I think what's so interesting is that um, kind of like what we talked about. Like we talked about how the higher your ACE score, the higher your risk is for psychological and medical problems, but you don't really know that at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And it
Mm-hmm.
doesn't mean that you're going to suffer from it. So, say if you do have a higher ACE score, it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to suffer from it because it's. I think it's so dependent on the person because people react differently. And I think you talked about this earlier. People's resiliencies are a lot different with how they react to those situations as well. And so,
Mm-hmm.
I think that's what's so important about like what you talked about with trauma is that we do gain an understanding of it because we might not really understand um, the effects that it's really going to have on us.
Yeah, and just to say, we talked about like research and professionals learning more, but my greatest source of information and knowledge are the students I work with. They enlighten me, they educate me. I respect them, and they frustrate me. I'm not gonna lie. I'm gonna be genuine. I'm gonna just ask them directly, what's going on here? Come on. Come on, man. I have some come on, man moments with some of the guys. I'm like, come on, man. But that's only because I've established a relationship. I've respected them despite what has happened. I still embrace them. So it's very important that we continue to learn from the young people that will educate us, because again, right, context, now ACEs may seem outdated because it doesn't maybe look at technology, right? You have to look at it in the context of trauma through technology. What's the impact of that versus in-person trauma? And so there's all kinds of questions that come up with every generation of kids and every generation of technology and change and COVID, trauma itself. I don't know what the long-term effect of trauma will be on development from this COVID situation.
Sure.
We say it's unnatural, but for kids that are young enough that it's going to be the norm for them, it's going to be their natural. So how do they react to this? So we have to look at things in the moment and long term to get a balance of how best to help, anyone, and it's not just young people like what we work with, but even older people. Older people, trauma lasts, like I said, through the lifespan and beyond. So if you feel like, well, I'm too old to change, think again. You have to be able to say, I can go back and face my trauma and get help with that, no matter what age I'm at. Because if you care about like your generations after you, then you should do it. It's not only helpful for you, but it can help literally your descendants. So yeah.
Yeah, and I'm glad you said that one thing about like asking the students, asking the people that you work with, people who are actually going through this, like what they are feeling, what they're experiencing. And don't get me wrong, like I'm not saying that we shouldn't trust the research that's been done. I think the research is great. I think that it's been actually very eye-opening, because I think you need to have that backup to be able to understand the importance of it, to be able to communicate to the world. But at the same time, I think that's so important, is like being able to have that personal relationship and being able to understand from that perspective is just going to be completely like just going to be the best way we can learn as well. Because even though
that's part of the treatment too.
Yeah, and we're not experts.
Yeah, right.
So
we have to respect them, and that's part of the treatment, to establish that, because I think a solid relationship is the key to helping kids be resilient. They just can't do it on their own to a certain degree. I mean, sure, genes play a role, but at least one positive adult being in their life makes a world of difference. So I feel like, it's sort of like, if not you, then who? You can't just assume, oh, they have that parent, they have that grandparent, that person could also be the source of some of the traumatic experience they're dealing with. So you have to seize the day. You have to do that. So all adults out there are part of the treatment, are the part of the antidote. We're the part of the vaccine for trauma. So I would encourage everyone to, never underestimate the power you have in a brief exchange with a young person, because you can really direct them and help them. And so you don't have to, again, be a counselor, a therapist, a teacher. You can just be a neighbor that checks in on the welfare of a kid that lives near you,
Yeah.
So, it's not rocket science too either,
Right. And so, and you talked about this a little bit, but if you have any more thoughts or can go a little bit more in depth with this question, is how does trauma affect our lives? Like, why is it so important that we understand the impact of trauma in somebody's life?
That is a good question. I'll probably have to keep it as brief. I think it really is about understanding the importance of being resilient, because if you let experiences create this trauma, then like you said, there's health risks. There's, it hurts you mentally, physically, emotionally, spiritually. There's so many dangers. We could get into a lot of it, but I mean, it also is an opportunity for growth. And so I want to get into that story real quick, because I think it can link into what you just asked me.
All right,
but,
go ahead.
There's a story about the carrot, the egg, and the coffee. So you might know this, Alan. Don't spoiler alert for anyone. But basically, it's the story of a young girl that was, maybe teenager. Let's say she's a teenager. And she was struggling with things in life. Just a lot of things were overwhelming her. And, she had a grandmother. So she would go to her for wisdom, for some, help. So she went to her grandmother and just told her, I'm struggling. Life, it just seems so hard right now. And maybe we're feeling like that right now with COVID. So her grandmother was someone who had lived a full life and was pretty wise, but she didn't say anything to her granddaughter. She just took her and said, let's go in the kitchen. I want to show you something. And she had this boiling water, 3 pots on the stove, and she put a carrot in one, she put an egg in the other, and she took some water out and put it in a coffee cup and had some coffee in there, and there was coffee, hot coffee. And she said, just what do you see? What do you see there? And the granddaughter, the girl said, she saw the carrot, and after a few minutes she could touch it, and she saw that it was very mushy, it was very soft. And then she saw the egg, and the egg had gotten hardened. It was tough. It was a hard-boiled egg, and she saw it got hardened. And then she kind of looked at the coffee. She even took a sip of the coffee, and she was like smiling, and she enjoyed the taste. And so she just turned to her grandmother and said, what does this mean? What does this mean? And the grandmother looked at the carrot, said, look, the water was this great adversity, okay, this great event, that, and see how they all reacted to this hot boiling water. The carrot that went in very firm and very, strong, you could snap it, it cracked, but once you put it in the water, it got mushy. It lost its structure. It got very weak. And then she said the egg, it got very hardened. Like, if you peel the egg and you see the yolk, it went from being very fluid and very, flexible to then very hardened and bitter. That experience left it bitter. It left it hard. And then they said, but look at the coffee. The coffee, the hot water, the coffee was able to, it brought out the strengths of the characteristics that make the coffee so pleasurable, so great. That hot water had transformed that coffee and brought out the best in it. It gave it an opportunity to grow and to become something better than just the coffee grinds that were there before. And I'm not trying to suggest that everyone's going to come out of trauma just this enlightened person,
right?
But we can try to, like I said, build up resiliency, build up our relationships so that we can weather that storm, and then maybe after it's passed we can grow, or maybe even in the middle of it we can try to survive it and get stronger. So I just, like I say, people react differently. So we can't just say, well, that person had lucky genes or grew up with the right parents, grew up in the right school district. That's not fair. We have to be able to break those cycles, and it's not going to be something that we solve for them, but we can walk along with them, because then they're going to be empowered to change, and they can take the steps they need. So even during COVID, I feel like that's kind of the hot water of the story. Maybe during this time we grow, we recognize values that we have inside of us, strengths inside of us, and we try to bring out the best. Instead of bringing out the worst, we try to bring out the best. We appeal to our higher angels or our higher calling. And so I'm like, in that way, I'm kind of rejuvenated in a way. I mean, I don't want COVID to be here, but if I have a chance to go back into school and really help the kids deal with not only COVID, but their pre-existing trauma that they're dealing with, that's what brings out my passion. Like, I need to be there, and if I have to wear a mask or, dump a, hand sanitizer on my head, I don't care. I'll take on that risk. I love the healthcare, the first responders, all the healthcare workers, but all of us, have to realize that we have to take those steps to help each other too. And we're going to take on some of that risk, but we can do it. It's worth it. I mean, I know that in-person connection is worth, taking some cautious risks, not just putting us out there where we're just, causing harm, but to try to really, have stronger relationships, that are not dependent on Zoom, not dependent on the Wi-Fi, we can actually, reconnect or connect stronger than before. So that was my long story. Hopefully, I got a chance to say it. But
all right, so you got it in.
Got it in. Yeah, I remember it. Yeah.
So something I want to talk, kind of get a little bit specific about, and I don't know if I can articulate it the best way, but I'm going to try. So something that I feel is so important about trauma is how it affects our brains. So Jacqueline talked in one of the last podcasts about the brain and how fear and kind of like how the brain responds to it. And so Dr.
Mm-hmm.
Burst Harris talked about how she researched and understood how exposure to trauma affected just not our brains and our bodies. And something that we've talked about is how our brain is continually developing until the age of 25. That's when our brain is stop developing. And so when we think about this is that, like, if say like people are experiencing ACEs and they're experiencing that before 18, and that's still in their developmental stage of their brain. And so it definitely affects the decisions that you're going to make.
Yes.
It's going to affect um, those kind of things. And so kind of like specifically, it talks about how trauma can cause more fight or flight responses. And also it can
Mm-hmm.
affect like our pleasure system in our brain. So like our even like things that brings us pleasure, like is you react a little bit differently. So let me give you an example
Mm-hmm.
like of that. So like say like if you've experienced trauma and you just run outside, it's not like enough for your pleasure system like it might be for someone else.
Mm-hmm.
And then whenever, but then you feel like you have to do something like a little bit more riskier, such as maybe
Yes.
sprinting or running with the bulls to eventually get that kind of to meet your pleasure system. And so that's what they talk about is whenever I think it's four or higher ACEs is how it can lead to substance dependence or riskier
Mm-hmm. Risk
behaviors.
taking.
And
Yep.
so, and so I think that when our brains are compromised in areas of that way, where we're functioning like it's kind of like we have maladaptive software, like we don't have the best like thoughts or beliefs or structure to be able to make the best decisions in our life. And so, and I
Mm-hmm.
think that's the thing is that's what trauma can do. It's not just that it happened to us, but it literally affects like our whole being as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's a great point, and I would even add that that's where mindfulness comes in. And I know that
Mm-hmm.
that is something that I haven't embraced probably as fully as I should for myself. But I
Mm-hmm.
think that it's worth the chance to try to even get kids at a young age to practice and to learn that, because that can be a really healthy way to avoid this, effect of trauma. To kind of give them tools to you know uh, stop them before they go into that risk taking area, because
Uh-huh.
that makes sense. I mean, if you're going through trauma, you're going to try to treat it no matter what. And if getting a few minutes of escape through taking a drug without even knowing that it will get you addicted, they're going to do that. And if unfortunately, it's around too. It's around. I mean, I know anyone can get to it, but if you have less resources to help you as far as adults that want to spend time with you or talk about the risks, you're going to the opportunities are greater. You're gonna have that chance. So it's a very difficult situation because you're in the middle of trauma
Mm-hmm.
and you're asked to you don't have any coping tools, you don't have any resources to help you. You really are on your own. And then if someone comes along and says, you know what, let's do this, it's a chance for you to feel actually alive and
Mm-hmm.
feel that you have something that can bring you some peace from the trauma. You're going to jump at it. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah, that's those are the things that really you have to think about when you're dealing with people going through trauma, is that, and you have to do it with grace. You can't go with
Yeah.
judgment. Judgment, that's the biggest key. And we're all traumatized to a certain level, so we're going to have blinders on. But if we just see
Right.
them as trouble and we think we can just jail them, that's not going to heal anyone. That's just going to continue that whole trauma effect impact. And by that time they come out, they may have kids of their own, and then that chain continues. And like you said, there it is. Incarceration is one of the ACEs 10. So it's like, okay, this damaging way to deal with consequences. And that's why I'm a big believer in looking at trauma when you look at consequences and discipline as well. I mean, there should be
Uh-huh.
consequences, but it should be done through the lens of what's your trauma background. If it's done in isolation, it doesn't even teach anyone how to live better. And it's all about teachable moments. It's not
Mm-hmm.
about making someone, punishing them for just the sake of punishing, and so I
Mm-hmm.
think that the school district is trying to do that too. They have all kinds of things like restorative practices that talk
Okay.
about how to look at it based on that individual situation, and not to just let them get away with something and not have a consequence, but to understand what is it that is pushing them to that point. Like you said, what
Yeah.
is the trauma? What's happened to them? So
Yeah.
very good point. Very good point, Alan. You're
Thank
spot
you.
on.
And so, let me ask you something. So you talked about this a little bit. Like you talked about taking the ACEs test for yourself. And so, why is it important that we're aware of our own personal trauma experiences?
Well, I think self-awareness is important. I'm not going to say it's above like these other needs that we see now, like getting food and shelter, but I think so. It can be a privilege to be able to just even consider, self-awareness.
Mm-hmm.
Whether you want to call it self-awareness, self-knowledge, I think there's power to it, and it also helps you know what your blind spots are. So, for
Mm-hmm.
example, if I'm working with a kid, and like you said, I don't understand that kid's experience. Let's just use a simple one. A huge factor in ACEs, which almost a lot of people share, it's not like incarceration. That's a big one too. It's divorce. Divorce. So, just the simple fact that if I'm working with a kid that is going through, having big struggle with their parents' divorce, I have not experienced that. So I may not be sensitive to that. I may minimize that. Or let's say I did go through divorce. It may trigger my own trauma. And if I haven't processed through that, I can't be of any help really effectively to that
Mm-hmm.
student. So, I think it's just very, very important to understand, even if your trauma is one, even if your score is one, just to know, because everyone's trauma can impact, and like you said, I mean, you may have a low score, but you may have a
Mm-hmm.
very difficult time with that one factor. So, trauma can be sometimes common, but then sometimes it's very unique. It's very unique to that person. For example, kids that are not graduating, it'd be easy for us adults to say, "Oh, come on, what's so big about a graduation?" That could be
Mm-hmm.
trauma. That could be a traumatic reaction, because they may be the first person in their family to graduate high school. They were looking forward to it. That loss, it is
Sure.
partly like grief. So it's very easy for adults to kind of minimize. I'll give you another example: breaking up with a girl or boy. First love. I deal with that a lot. It's so easy for
Yeah.
the adults to come in and say, "Oh, you'll find someone else," or were you going to marry that person? No, you have to be sensitive to that trauma and to understand,
Yeah.
for that person, it's real. It's real. So, I just think that starting with yourself is always a good point, because if you if you can kind of address your own trauma history, then you may be more sensitive to others, and be
Yeah.
aware of the pitfalls of over identification or minimization. Those are the two sides of the spectrum: to just minimize the trauma, or to just say it's nothing, or to just over identify, and then you're down there with them reliving your own trauma because you went through that, and you didn't process through that. You just kind of never addressed it, and that unresolved trauma is what we say, right? The unresolved trauma. So I think it's okay if you resolve your trauma to help someone that's going through a similar trauma. But if it's unresolved, you're no help to anyone. You're not even helping
Right.
yourself. So
Yeah. Yeah,
self-help.
and I just feel like, yeah, it's just so important for us to have an awareness and understanding of how trauma affects our brains, our bodies, and our lives. Because, I mean, I think the studies show that it can definitely have a huge impact on it later on. And so, and like, say, if we've already experienced it, just to kind of understand kind of how we got there. And so I think that it helps us to be able to show prevention and intervene in those situations. And I think
Mhm.
also just like understanding the risk factors that are most like associated with trauma. It's not limited to these, but they're just like some that they've seen, which is poverty, like violence, and poor social connections as
Yes.
well. And so, kind of
Yeah.
just understanding like that you may be at a higher risk, and that's something that you kind of like talked about earlier. Is you can pass on to your kids or pass on generations as well. Yeah.
Yeah, the long term. Even if you're not aware of something, it can still be a factor. Like we're studying with genetics and knowing the generational impact of trauma, and that's
Hmm.
where science can really help us. So it's important to be aware. Like you said, I would, if anyone remember, that's the first thing. I mean, if I could just appeal to people that may watch this, it's like, if you don't know anything about ACEs, go out there and Google it, go to a website, find it, and
Yeah,
just take it, but
for
that's the
sure.
first step. It's
Yeah.
not a big, you can do it. So.
Yeah, and I got a couple more questions for you because and you
Okay.
talked about this earlier, and I think this is so important. I really want to take some time with it, which is how resiliency. Like, I mean, I've learned how some youth who can actually become stronger through the toughest situations. I think I've seen youth that have done that. I'm sure you have as well. And also, I know that it varies per person, and like it just,
Mm-hmm.
and some who have experienced trauma, difficulties in their lives. I mean, it can develop resilience. And so, is it possible that like trauma can actually be an advantage for some people? Because I think we've talked about the disadvantages, but like, are there advantages to having trauma? If that makes
Uh,
sense.
yeah, I know what you're saying.
Yeah.
I think there's opportunities. I don't know if there are advantages, right? But I think, because
Right.
I think, if only one or two people kind of come out of the experience stronger and 98 suffered,
Sure.
it's not an advantage, right? We need to like make it a scope. It needs to be a wide scope. And so I use a little example. They did a little study. This is anecdotal, but they were looking at studying why certain people got out of disadvantaged neighborhoods and were able to get out of poverty, get out of these places and be successful. I know
Mm-hmm.
it's a simplistic story, but they went and interviewed people at the in the neighborhood. They first went there and they asked the people that were there behind them, that stayed behind, that couldn't get out of that. They said, "What is it about this neighborhood that makes it so hard?" They said, "Oh, we have the worst schools. There's drug dealers. There's crime. There's all kinds of things here." And so then they went and asked the same, a different group, the ones that had kind of rose above this trauma to get out of that situation. They said, "What helped you get out of that?" And they said, "The bad schools, the crime, the drugs, So it's a matter of perspective, but I don't want to minimize the genetics. There is a genetic component, but I think it's
Mm-hmm.
like nature and nurture. You need the
Sure.
experience plus the genes. Like, why does, like, I have 3 cousins with an alcoholic dad that died young and 2 are alcoholics, 1 is not. Like, what happens there? Our twin studies, like, how does one succeed while the other doesn't? So I think it's partly genetics, but I think you can overcome that genetic hurdle by looking at things with a new perspective, with
Mm-hmm.
self-knowledge, with motivation, which all these, with resiliency. And then, like I said, what may be the secret weapon of all is being able to form connections with others. That is the huge. That's the advantage, if you want to say, is if you are able to form, and it really means even if you're like antisocial, but you
Mm-hmm.
still feel like that one person can connect with you. And from that one relationship, it opens you up to possibilities with other people, and not to see people as not, something to avoid. And I can't trust them. I can't, that pushes people. And then they can see that, oh, wow, education matters, or, oh, I can be more than this. I can take, and that's when all those kind of things align, the stars can align. But I think it starts with like the relationships, and
Mm-hmm.
then it builds on there. And I do think really that anyone can, heal or move forward past trauma, because I believe in the ability of people. And I think, with the right kind of research too, we'll learn how to maybe stop this generational trauma,
Mm-hmm.
which then can impact a class of people. That would be like my big I have a dream moment. Like,
Yeah.
that would be awesome. But we see that even with COVID. Why do certain people, especially communities of color, they're impacted more by COVID? This is another wake-up call that our health literally depends on our trauma history, our health history, and it gives us an opportunity. Instead of feeling scared and saying, you know what, we can look at it. How do we address this? Not only the health issues, but the underlying trauma issues for groups of people that are at risk.
Yeah.
It's not just immune deficient people. It's probably those immune deficient people also go along hand in hand with the trauma history. We're just not asking those questions enough, along with the health, the literal health needs of people. So again, this is opportunity, and I hope that we just take it up. We take it up in the future and say, hey, this COVID thing that's affecting the whole world is a wake-up call to address not only health conditions, but living conditions, trauma
Uh-huh.
conditions. And already you see that, right? The domestic abuse reports are, that's going up, unfortunately, as part of the COVID lockdown. And that's what gets me worried about students I work with. It's like, what's happening that's not being reported behind closed doors because of the COVID. So we've got to try to address that. We've got to try to get that to be not such a big problem. Reduce the risk that can create trauma in the first place, man-made trauma, because that's the place where we can have the most control. We can't stop weather and this and that maybe, and COVID as much, but we can start with healing the human conditions that cause trauma, those things on the ACEs, that are human caused, abuse, reducing abuse, reducing, building up relationships, having healthier relationships. So, I believe there's a lot of hope there. So to get to your point of, opportunity, there's even opportunity now during COVID, even though we may feel anxious and depressed, and it's okay. There's opportunity. So I look forward to that. I say, I'm going to seize it myself, and I hope everybody else can do it too. Just take that ACEs score, become aware, and know that you have a power to influence others, in a positive way. So.
Yeah, and I'm glad that you said that, because I think the thing is that, like, say that you do score higher on it, it doesn't mean that you're doomed. It doesn't mean that you're going to have to, you don't have to experience it. It's stating that, the risks are higher, but it doesn't mean that there's not something we can do about it. No matter where we are, whatever age we are, we can do that. And and I think there is just something about, like, going through something and overcoming something that gives you a power that, like, some people that maybe haven't been through that experience don't know what that's like, and maybe they don't know how to react in those situations. And so in some ways, I see I think you're right. Like, it does create these opportunities. It can create these, like, confidence in yourself whenever situations similar and know how to react. And so something something that I thought about, and this is before you even talked about the MCU, is I just like you, I love the MCU. I'm a huge, like, Marvel fan. Like, I think last year I watched all of them all together. And and so I saw this article that talked about every single one of the Avengers' greatest weaknesses. And so I looked at one of them, and this one I thought was really interesting, which was Tony Stark. And they talked about his greatest weakness was putting everything on his shoulders. I thought it would be like narcissism or like a lot of other things, but it said putting everything on his shoulders. And then, so when I think about it, though, like, it makes sense. So when we look at the first Avengers movie, by the way, if you haven't seen the Avengers movie, these are all huge spoilers. Yeah. So just, like, skip through this part of it. So he goes through the wormhole and experiences, like, all this, like, outer space and threats to the world, and then, almost dies from it. And so there's some trauma that he experienced just right there, and even you see in the other movies how he experiences PTSD and how he feels really badly about letting people down, or, like, people, like, dying on his watch. And so, like, he really and how it affected him, like, with his personal relationships as well. And so, but the thing is it, like, also led him to, like, as a superhero, say, I've got to do something about this. I can't just not be a superhero. I got to actually do these things. And I think that's what's so, like, amazing about how his story ended. And spoiler again, an Endgame, is that he, like, whenever all that stuff happened, where a lot of people lost, he was, like, one of the few people that actually was doing really well for himself. He had a family. He was at peace. Like, he had, like, everything that, you could say you want, but there was just something about him that, like, felt like, there's something I can do to be able to help bring people back. And then eventually, like, he ended up giving his life for that, so that, like, evil could be gone. And so it's just a really, like, so that's why I love the Marvel, story and how they intertwine it together.
They're human stories about superheroes, but they're very human. They're human grounded.
Yeah,
so that's
exactly.
what makes it so great. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that's
And so I think that's why, like, I think that, like, you know, even and I think that's the same thing, even with our weaknesses or things that we've gone through, it can be in a ways we can use that as strengths as well. And it's just like being able to find the way to use it to be productive.
Yeah, yeah, we have to appeal to each other's inner superhero, right?
Yeah.
That's what I like to do. And just to let you know, I know I'm a geek on it, but I have posters in my room, my office, or wherever I take kids in there, and by far my Marvel poster gets the most comments. And so
Yeah.
I mean, Stan Lee was a genius, and you know, in a way, he probably never thought that his stories would help kids. And I think
Sure.
whatever we have to use, you know, whatever, if we're just, you know, I can talk to a kid about about a Marvel movie, and we can bond over that better than any counseling technique that they teach you in school. So I think it is good to use whatever you can. And I think it is appealing to their inner superhero. I mean, it's believing
Yeah.
in them. And so I'm with you. But I tell everyone, you got to watch Marvel. If you're quarantined anyway or stuck
Yeah.
inside and have access,
Might
you
as
got to,
well.
I mean,
Yeah.
you got to watch them and just know that we're not alone. We're not, if heroes struggle, look at us, you know, look at us.
Yeah.
But you're right. But, you know, Iron Man at the end, he couldn't live with not helping others. Like it would have
Right.
been more guilt on him not to make the
Sure.
sacrifice. So I think
Yeah,
that,
for sure.
that's what we need to do. We need to be able to say we can take on some risks. And I'm not talking about just wearing a mask or going outside, but taking the risk of helping someone, reaching out and connecting with someone, whether it's a neighbor, whether it's students, whether it's someone in the parking lot that is older that doesn't feel scared to go get their groceries. I mean, there was a Facebook, thing video about that, about a young lady that helped, an elderly woman. And it's just, that's inspiring. I think, even this day, I'm so proud of people. I think that society is reacting to this COVID in relatively a positive way. I mean, making
Yeah.
the sacrifices. And so my students, I say my students, the students I work with, William James, love it, and
Hmm.
their families. I mean, all of us are showing our strengths right now. And that's what
Hmm.
you said. It comes back to your point that during a traumatic event, it can still bring out those qualities that are in all of us to be better and to be stronger and to heal. And I just hope
Yeah.
that once the threat goes down, we continue with it, because it's easy to
Yeah.
forget. We have short-term memories here, and we need to keep this and take it and have a real change of heart, and reach out and be able to help each other and help society with the impact of trauma beyond COVID, back to the regular ACEs, back to the everyday trauma. We can't just say, well, this threat's gone, we can go on as normal. We have to be Tony Stark. We have to say, no, I choose not to ignore it. I can't
Yeah.
live my life, privileged life. I'm going to make the sacrifice, whatever that may be, to help,
Hmm.
a fellow person. And so,
Yeah.
yeah, you're spot on with that. And like I said, MCU all the way. My son would
Agreed.
agree. He is not a DC guy. One of his like gaming IDs is Marvel Rocks and some number. I don't know what it is. So he's the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. So I'm proud of him that he chose the Marvel universe over DC. But anyway, that's a whole other podcast.
Yeah.
But it's been fun though, Al. I hate to be keeping you guys long. You got to trim this down or something, because you know me.
Yeah.
But
No, it's all
yeah,
right. I mean, it's good. It's good conversation. And so,
that's
last thing
right.
I want to ask you, before we go to our final, like the questions that I ask everybody at the end, is
Okay.
how can we cope and move forward or help others who may be struggling with trauma, whether experienced in the past or present? Because I think that's something very important, is once we know about it, what can we do about it, and how can we help
Yeah.
people?
Well, that's a good question, and I wish I had all the answers, but I think we have to reframe things. It's not like there's a magic cure, just like there's no magic vaccine that's available for COVID. I think it's a human condition, but there are ways that humans can help with it.
Yeah.
Because the thing is, we kind of can cause trauma ourselves, but we can also address trauma and help heal trauma. So the power is within us. So it's kind of an individual situation, but I think we have to be open. We have to be learning more about trauma. We have to be open to addressing our own trauma, like you said. Those are those simple steps we can take to helping others, but we have to reframe literally the words that come out of our mouth. Like literally, what's wrong with you becomes, what's happened to you? Tell me your story.
Hmm.
Or just calm down. Like when people are upset, we want to minimize their expression and we say, calm down. And instead of saying maybe, how can I help you? How can I help you? You know, there's a whole list of there, and I don't have them all top of my head, but there's a whole list of things that you can Google, and I can even share that, you know, that, you know, just how you change the language, you know, it going from a judgmental perspective or a punitive way to look at something to a more open way to understanding that that person's in pain. That person's in pain. And just, you know, like I said, there was a kid that was acting out at my school, and he didn't know me, so he didn't want to talk to me. He literally got in the fetal position and had his hoodie over his head. And the rule was no hoodies, right? If we went there to take off that hoodie, when we, you know, it wasn't about that. It wasn't about him breaking a rule. He just wanted to be in a safe place and literally putting the hoodie over. So he wouldn't talk to me, but he nodded to me. But I was trying to find teachers that knew him. Long story short, I didn't feel like I could help him, but I should have been willing to stay longer. But I went back, and later when I documented in our computer what had happened with this kid, because it took a probation officer to come in and take this boy home because he didn't have any way to get home. I looked and saw a note saying that his brother had died a year earlier. Wow. So there was the trauma history, Alan. And I say this not to get people depressed or to leave this with, but I think it shows that we have to be willing to understand that not everything people are doing is about you. It's about them. You know, Sure. It's not about disrespecting you or lashing out at you. It may seem like that on the surface, but it's all about them and what happened to them. And my only regret was I did not see that note before, because if I had seen that note, I would have been more willing to stick it through with him, because he wasn't being rude to me. He wasn't responding, but he was nodding to some of my questions. It's just I thought that someone else could help them better than I could, and they couldn't. The people that were supposed to be closest to him couldn't do it. They wiped their hands clear of him. It took his probation officer to come up there and get him home safely, but it was because of trauma that he was acting out. So I come back to that. Don't look at every behavior in a negative light. Look at it in the light of trauma, because that can sometimes give you grace. You know, give someone grace. Don't judge or don't throw the first stone. You know, understand that it's not about you or other people. It's usually about them. You know, it's about the pain that they're feeling, and it's not about being disrespectful to you or lashing out at you. I think if you just take that reframing, that look at it in a different perception, you know, a different perception, take a different perspective and a different way, that can open up a lot of opportunities. Then you can get creative with how you help that person. But it takes that shift. If you take that tiny shift at the beginning, that can be a huge shift, that can be all you need to get that going to help someone. So I don't have all the answers and specifics of how to help, but I would encourage people to take a shift and to get centered, to get, you know, address your trauma, use mindfulness, whatever you need to stay focused and calm when others are doing things. So that way you can look beyond the behavior and see how you can really help someone. That's the, you know, first step, I think.
Yeah, and like, and I would say, like, if you like understand and aware and kind of see how this has been affecting you, and you want help and need like help. I mean, I think that like seeing a cognitive behavioral therapy, or I know that there's therapists that do specifically that do focus on trauma therapy as well.
Trauma focused.
Trauma informed. EMDR as well, like that does those practices. And also, like you talked about it earlier about like practicing mindfulness. And because I think that's like kind of like what we talked about, is that trauma can affect your brain. It can kind of cause some maladaptive software in your brain, like if your brain was a computer. And so like to be able to, and that's a lot of what cognitive behavioral therapy does, is it be able to challenge those thoughts and be able to help you whenever you're having those thoughts as well. And so, I think that kind of like what you talked about is that we talk about how we're not alone, that we need to stay connected. And that's something that's very important, especially when you experience something like that, because it can feel like you're alone. It can feel like nobody else understands it. And so just to be able to connect with someone, even if they haven't experienced it or know what it's like, they can still be able to help you process through that as well. And I think that's something that's something with us as counselors, is we might not necessarily experience exactly. We don't know exactly how you're feeling. There's no way we can. But at the same time, there is that ability to be able to connect and be able to do some practices that can help you in the long run as well. And I think also, just like I think it's so important that we identify what our protective factors are. And like some that are really encourages like supportive family networks, communities that are supportive towards families, and like having access to social services is going to be very important. And so like, what are your protective factors, and what are things that work for you? And I think it's just like kind of a process. It's know that it may be a struggle all the time, but at the same time, knowing what your protective factors are is going to be something that's really important. Let me ask you the last 3 questions that I ask people, like, because of how unique this experience is. These are like 3 questions I like to ask people, which is, what is one thing you most miss during this isolation quarantine period?
Oh, wow. Okay. Well, I think it's just the freedom to be able to do something. Like, I'm not going to lie and say, well, I was just Mr. Social, outside work, or I went to go see a Ranger game, maybe, I think it's not that. It's just having the freedom. And I think freedom is so undervalued, and I think kids need that sense of freedom too. So it's not like, oh, I would be out eating out every night or camping. So there's nothing, specific, but I do think it would involve my family, having the freedom to go somewhere and just go to a movie, like a full, full group of people, or, being there in the movie theater and just seeing how people enjoying the movie, the energy, or going to get a frozen yogurt. My daughter loves Yogurtland. So it's like, oh, well, we want to go back, or just doing the everyday things that we could do with people around us. Just that's what I miss. It's not one specific thing. It's just, that connection. So
yeah,
we'll get that back though, Alan. We're going to get that back. I have faith. So,
yeah,
I think we'll get back there.
Yeah, I do too. What's one thing you've learned through this time? Like something you could take away from this experience?
Ooh. Well, because I don't profess to be this wise old man. I am an old man, as you reminded at the beginning of the podcast, but so I don't have this like deep insight. And I mean, I struggle too. I think that's important, that people understand that your counselor, your therapist, they don't have the answers. If you look to them for the answers, that's going to be the wrong direction. You have to look inward, not outward, right?
Right.
So, I'm not going to sit here and say I haven't felt anxious, I haven't felt impacted. But, I think I have gained some perspective that, that the world, there's a lot more suffering that we're not aware of. Sometimes it takes a greater pandemic to expose even the everyday suffering when people lose a job. Maybe when there's just one person out of 100 that you may learn loses a job, you might be able to ignore that and say, well, you know what? They'll find another job. But when 30 million people, or a group, when everything just goes down so quickly, you realize how fragile society is, how fragile this planet is. So I feel like I've just gained a deeper perspective and a deeper gratitude for all the things that we take for granted. I feel like impassioned to talk to kids about saving this planet because it's in their hands. It's not fair that we left them a destroyed planet, and that could be a whole other podcast. But I think that they need to be empowered. It has to be everyone involved to care. And I think once you get a kid to care about something outside of them, they're going to care about themselves. I believe that strongly. So if you can get a kid passionate in terms of caring for even another person, that's a huge protective factor that will help them deal with, with the trauma and deal with other things. So, I just feel like we have to have that perspective to feel like, okay, now we care even more about each other and about the environment, about the future of this world. So that's kind of what I've gotten. I've gotten deeper with that. So that would be my takeaway. Yeah. Something.
Okay. What is one thing that you most look forward to when we are free again? When as we're back out in the world and don't have as much restrictions and those kind of things.
Yeah. That's a hard one, because it can be, I think it's just a collection of small things. Again, it's not one big thing. Like, I can't wait to go see a football game. I can live without that. I think it could be just moments in time, whether it's, spending I do a thing where I do like a high five with students or a fist bump or something, and now I have to worry about that for their sake. I'm like, I don't want to freak them out. But it's like those little connective little dots of a day or a week or a lifetime that you just take for granted, whether, it's like I said, a fist bump, a smile, it's being around others and feeling their energy. It's also sharing in their pain. That's part of what a counselor needs to be prepared to do is to be able to absorb some of that and process through that for themselves, and it's called secondary trauma, right? So be careful with that, too. But, the ability to just, be around people again, connect, like, when I know we don't see each other very often, but when I always enjoy that, Alan, just connecting over a coffee and catching with your feet of you're running, your latest marathon or your love of your Rangers, that's what makes it special. It's like, you can see that in a profile and talk to someone through Zoom, but you don't fully appreciate the real essence of a person until you're there. And we're wired to be social, so important.
Yeah.
So I can't wait for that. And it's going to take time, but I think we have to take, even a journey of 1,000 miles starts with a single step. So if we take precautions, we open up, we just don't do that for the business sense of just getting people back their job. It's also to reconnect. I may not high five someone when I go back to school, but I can still smile at them. I can still do my Indian namaste, my Indian namaste. That's what I'm going to do. Think of different ways to just be together in each other's presence. That's what I'm going to look forward to. So,
yeah. All right. Well, thank you. Thank you for being a guest on my podcast today, Denny. I appreciate you being here and taking that time. And I also appreciate all the work you're doing. And I'm just amazed like how sustainable you've been able to work with youth for all these years and still going strong.
Gray, right? Yeah.
And I'm also glad that, we get to work near each other and with similar populations. And ultimately, I really appreciate the investment that you put into me as a master's student and LPC intern. And even now, we still have a relationship, we still connect and still learning from you. And so I think it's really cool, not just kind of how we're 6 years, we're still connected and still working in some capacity together. But also how we grew up in similar cultures where counseling was not really a desired or destined career path for people like us. And so I think it's really cool that that's where we're at. That both of us, that's what we're doing, that we decided to, follow our passions to be able to help people in that way. And so I appreciate that. I thank you for being such an important part of my career. And is there anything else you want to say before we sign off?
No, thank you. Now I want to thank you, Alan. I'm sorry I rubbed it off on you because you ended up kind of following the path with the same population. But I'm very proud of all the work you've done. And, you're a very caring person. I think that the Boys Club and Girls Club is very lucky to have you working with these guys. And it's very important for people to see us, not just to see a counselor in a certain way. And so I think it's good. And, males are endangered population and therapists. So I think it's very empowering for our young guys to have positive, caring, empathetic males in their life. So thank you, Alan. And I hope we can catch up. Like I said, we got to make it more often once we can get, out there in the world, but we can catch up in person next time.
Definitely.
So thank you.
Yes.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Denny. And and remember, everyone, just like we talked about, I know that, at least in Texas, I know that people in other areas don't have the same, blessing that we have in some ways to have a little bit more freedom. But please just to remember to be healthy, stay safe, and please be kind to one another during this time. And just keep pushing through. And I know that we're going to get through this. So we will see you next week.